was sort of a little bit part of that denial of not wanting to have a conversation. So me writing this book was like, let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation in the town, as well as a broader conversation in the United States about these towns who are also being silenced or ignored too by the larger, by the federal government, by the state government, by the general, like, progressive liberal class, so to speak. Let's bring them out of the sort of periphery, and not that I'm saying I'm bringing them out. I in this book I use the collective we, because I feel, even though I'm not working in the working class, by definition, how I define that is if you shower after work instead of before work, that's kind of my definition of working class. But like, I'm not in the working class anymore. I'm a writer. I don't even know what that is, but like, let's have these conversations. Let's bring this forward so that we can even start to address what Douglas is talking about, and it was so funny to hear that woman. I was just shocked at, she was like, we've already had that conversation. I was like, wait a minute, we have not had that conversation. It has not happened. And then the other part of that conversation has been, sort of perverted, people in the working class have in the past, in a sort of more benevolent past, were seen as, salt of the earth and very loyal. And, and that definition has changed, especially in the last 4 years, with Trump entering the scene. And so it became a little bit of a different conversation as I was writing the book. Speaking of tyrants, I mean, there's a tyrant. I wrote that epigraph was there before he came on board. I've been working on this for 10 years. So anyway, then it became another added part of the conversation to talk about the working class and say, they're not all rednecks and racists and dumb. These are people that are, they're not salt of the earth either. They're just like kind of ordinary people with ordinary needs, but the lives and the pressures they've been living under have been extraordinary. And I don't think that people really know that.
But I want to at once hone in and pull back, because as we're talking about conversation, it occurs to me that people entering our conversation, overhearing, and are on the periphery, are not sure what the book is about.
Oh, right.
So tell us. So the book is about, Mexico, Maine.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm in a town, and no, it's not your fault. It's mine. And so, tell us about this town, and what the book is in pursuit of the story. It's in pursuit of. But as you're doing that, also, one of the reactions people have had time and again is that, oh, this could be my town. That the variables may be different, but the algebra is the same.
Yeah.
So tell us about Milltown and about Mexico, Maine, and what drew you into writing this book. A question you've answered a million times before, I know.
No, but it's always different though.
There's a particular draw, that pull you in, that aroused your curiosity, but more than your curiosity, also aroused your desire to set up limits, by way of writing, to respond with words and not blows. So, tell us about Milltown, what's Milltown, and also what drove you to spend an inordinate amount of time, reams and reams and reams of paper, becoming a scientist to write it.
I grew up in this working class town of Mexico, Maine. It's a very small town, maybe 5,000 people on the Androscoggin River, Western Maine near Canada. For over 100 years, our community orbited around this paper mill, and the mill provided most jobs for people in the town and generations of my family, 3 generations, 4 if you include my sister who worked there one summer part-time. The thing is, I had a happy childhood. This is not about a traumatic childhood rendering or anything like that. But it was years after I moved away that I realized there was something amiss, and that there was maybe a price that I paid for having such a happy childhood. And the price eventually everybody paid, everybody on this phone call paid, which we can get into later. But the mill, I realized that, we joked about it and called it Cancer Valley when I was growing up. And we joked about that. And then didn't really start thinking about it till I was in my 40s about what that really meant, until people I knew were getting sick, and dying. So while it provided safety, security, community jobs, it also contributed to the destruction of people's health and to our environment, come to find out. But and that didn't happen. That wasn't really like, I didn't come to the book thinking that. And so to ask what led me to write about it was really my grandfather's obituary. Actually, it was his obituary and his death certificate. It contained, I found it when I was doing genealogy information. It contained a lot of things I hadn't known about him. And so like how he died, and which basically was from the mill. It didn't say that, but that's further down the line. Who his mother was. Anyway, I sought to confirm these details as they were laid out. And then come to find out, everything on those documents were wrong or somehow incomplete. So I was like, if an obituary, which is like a vital record, or a death certificate, is a vital record, if those are wrong or inaccurate, like what else could be wrong in history's archives, right? So I'm a curious person. So I was like, I'm just going to follow these sort of breadcrumbs of first my grandfather. And then as I followed all the mysteries of where he came from and all the things that were wrong in his records, I found a lot of other records wrong. So not just a curious person, but maybe an obsessive person about trying to find some kind of truth. I felt like I just had to like follow down that path, and everything I found in these, literally, as you said, piles of documents at the Maine Department of Environmental Protection, at genealogy. I went to France, I went to Prince Edward Island, I went to dozens of countries in between, and just digging through documents, and people would give me boxes with mouse poop in them and just boxes of stuff. There were so many things that were wrong, like even news articles. And so every time I found something that didn't jibe, I would try to prove. So this book became like sort of an evidentiary exploration. It was almost like I was putting together a quote legal case in a way. I used to be a paralegal, and it's a very poetic legal case. It's not written like that, but it was like, I'm going to find as much evidence as I can, and I'm just going to put it all down. Well, that became hard because this book is also an exploration of how that things that don't want to be found stay unfound. Like they just, it's like Bigfoot, who comes at the end of the book, so another thing he didn't, Bigfoot doesn't want to be found either. And he stays hidden in the woods. Anyway, that comes in the book. Seriously, Bigfoot is in this book. But so not with blows, but with words. So I thought, if I can just not just put down what is going on in this town, but put down how I tried to find the information and couldn't. It also shows the problems about environment and about our systems, and about how things can be so evasive and hidden, like how toxics are, how can you connect toxics to disease? It's a very vague sort of exercise to try to do that, that. And that's the thing about toxic disasters, and the thing about this book is that they are so decentralized and hard to pin down. And that sort of was in conversation with what I was finding. So yeah,
so it's a writer's detective.
I was a detective,
but like any, we know good detective story that you spend time digging in the small corners and uncovering evidence of the evidence, but with the intent to hand it over and someone is, brought to justice. In this case, what happens in these stories where you have a town that is seemingly so powerless, or the power is so disproportionate? What does it look like for this detective? Apart from amassing evidence, what comes in a further detective story? Is it that evidence is handed over and then the detective sits down, or what does justice look like in this detective story? Or what does justice begin to look like?
Yeah, I was going to say, what is justice is actually, I think the only justice that comes out of this book is actually this book itself. And I mean that in a very serious way, is because this trying to prove that the cancers in our town were connected to environmental problems is basically impossible. I'm never going to do that unless it's a very hard thing to prove, especially in a town where they didn't keep very good records, as I said. But it's also this, we were kept, and this happens to many people who are oppressed by environmental issues. We were kept in a state of gradual and perpetual injury, like a non-deliberate exposure to the possibility of death, that constant ambiguity. And so when I say that the justice that comes as this book, like I think everybody in my town has read this book, and now they have something to point to and to say, okay, here's a record, here's an actual record, even though my record is incomplete and frustrating, but at least it's a record of something that they can hold on to. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
No, it was, to have that, to live under that sort of toxic ambiguity. Not only we're not just talking about pollution either. And because if we're talking about the working class, we're talking about the past 40, 50, 60 years of, economic grievances and problems and all kinds of things that were also happening. So the ambiguity was not just environmental. They were living under the illusion that there was this American dream that they could reach somehow if they just kept working hard enough. And that, I think that just having this recognized the issues in the town and recognizing them, and I'm not giving myself credit, and I'm only saying that because people have told me that, like, they were felt so happy to be seen for once. Not everybody, there's a few people that weren't happy to be seen, but for the most part, like my aunt, I just found out today, has been complaining about me on Facebook, but on a forum that I can't access because I was blocked, which is really, and I write about this guy in the book. This forum is this is an interesting part of the evidence, and I'm going to say it because there's a Facebook page about this town, and he only allows like positive things to be talked about in it, and he doesn't like my book because it's not positive, or how he sees it as positive. And so, but he lets people talk about it, but he won't let me see the things they're talking about, and he won't let me comment on anything. It's like the most bizarre. It's part of the sort of evasiveness of everything, and people not wanting to sort of, I don't know, expose what is happening. Anyway, sorry to go down that.
I'm going to ask you a question and then have Noah jump in and join us as we're thinking this through. And it's writing as acknowledgement.
Yeah.
But this book is acknowledging the wrongs that were done in Mexico, Maine. It's acknowledging, the agency of the people who are there, who are so often looked at as, foolish people who
right
don't know what's good for them, and often needs an outsider much more sophisticated than there to come to tell them what it means to have their rights. It's also a way of acknowledging that there are many other towns like this, and these towns populated in many places, and part of understanding them means listening to the people who live and work and have their being in them. And so the book is this grand acknowledgement in multiple levels and spheres. It's you acknowledging how much the town meant to you, that you thought, oh, I'm out of here, and then you come back and recognize your deep fondness and affection for it. It's acknowledging the hard work and the rich dignity and humanity that exists in the working class. As often, sometimes even that very term is a way of lumping them almost as if they were a demographic category that is only important when both parties are running for election. And so I'd love to hear your reflections on writing about these tough issues, writing about environment, writing about people who also are often on the other end of our questions, particularly people who don't understand them or come with preconceived notions. What does it mean to write about that knowledge, about the environment, about injustice, and to interact with people in a way that, yes, gives rich room for their agency and dignity, but also at every step, from your encounter with them to the way they're rendered on the page, to how they're then spoken about and involved after the pages out in the world, how to deal with all of that from beginning to end, with a close focus on what it means to richly acknowledge them, to give recognition, and rich recognition and proper and loving acknowledgement. What does that look like? Or what are some of the ways that that looks like? And especially taking up all these students reading the book now, and in particular people saying, oh, well, this could be so many other towns. Should we shrug, give a collective shrug, or throw our hands in the air, or think, what can we do, or what next? What would you say to them, especially thinking about how acknowledgement is such a crucial part of your work and this book?
Right. I mean, for one thing, you said a key word too, which was listening is a really big part of acknowledging, for one thing, without going to this town and trying to imprint some kind of story I wanted to tell. I didn't walk in with some story. I just went in to see what and listen and observe. So that was part one. But another, thing of being from a place and going back home, kind of the plot, as it were, is me leaving and coming to this place. And with each departure and return, I was constantly interrogating and building what it means to be from this place, which also informed what I was writing about. And so, the first year of 10, it was like, I hate this place. Like I hated going, so as I went back, I would, it was like a constant, it was like being in a complicated relationship with somebody, right? You sort of leaving and return, and it doesn't really love me back, or how am I still part of the working class, even though I'm not working, even in a job? And what does it mean to stay in a place or leave a place that has defined you? So I kept having all this constant interrogation, right? And with that sort of leaving and coming, it really kind of enunciated the insider-outsider part of my relationship with it, because I was an insider, but not really. I live in a nice house in Connecticut, in Litchfield County, an hour and a half from New York City. So I'm not on the same financial plane. But at the same time, 3 generations of my family lived and died there, and they're buried there. So I became like this insider outside, sort of a witness and a participant too, which sort of also is acknowledged in the photographs in the book. There's about 33 photographs. So that witness participant tension, also a critic and an advocate, like just kind of walking that razor edge of all those roles of proximity and distance, which I think really gave me the right, or the way into writing this book, that tension. I couldn't have written it if I lived there, and I couldn't have written it if I had just left and never went back. It was the tension of it that helped sort of birth it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And right just before Ina asks no question, if I'm jumping, is I'd like you to turn to page 174.
I shall.
It might seem like it's one of the more quiet moments in the book, because there is one of the things that characterizes the book is just the rich dialogue and just hearing the voices. And in the midst of this huge legal brief,
Oh, right.
that's there, the evidence of the evidence of the evidence, the paralegal in you or the detective in you. There's also the observer in you, and what it means to write about these situations and to render people with rich verisimilitude, to render them as human beings with longings, aspirations, habits, quirks, that
Good and bad.
acknowledging them and seeing them. And so I'd like to take beside, look, a simple thing if you just walking through and to show just even in people not speaking, how they still speak so much. So, start at the next morning, page 174, and then read.
Oh, yeah.
And then read to the end of the second paragraph on page 176.
Okay. I'm going to use my PDF. It'll be easier to read from. Sorry, I'm just going to get that sentence up.
The next morning.
Yeah, there it is. And you just tell me when to stop. And where? I'm sorry, the next page. Okay, right before the three dots.
I'll tell you when to stop.
Okay, just say stop. Okay, thank you. The next morning, in a small windowless room in a basement, 30 years of Doc Martin's personal journals, bound, dated.
Hold on, stop a second.
Oh, wait. Oh, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Wow, I used that.
174.
Yeah, got it. The next morning, I arrive at the mill's lower gate where I watch a safety video and I'm issued earplugs and a hard hat. Janet meets and escorts me into a huge windowless room where the violent racket of number 15, a paper machine the size of a city block, greets me. A few weeks before, I'd Googled paper mill accidents and watched videos of men being sucked into the rollers, their bodies pinched flat. I read about legs crushed, fingers lost, blasts, explosions, amputations, falling cranes, fires, gas leaks, and mishaps which causes unknown. Such accidents are rare but feel accessible today, like when you look over the edge of a tall building with the irrational urge to jump. Janet tears a piece of coated paper off a fresh roll and hands it to me. I sniff it, but my senses are vandalized by the roiling noise, the claustrophobic heat of the machines, the stuttering fluorescent lights. You could lose track of time, decades, your thoughts in here. I think of my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, how they must have been crushed by the input, the output, the hours they couldn't hear. I can't imagine working here a single day. As Janet shepherds me around, I talk briefly to workers behind control panels or guys skirting the floor. I can't keep track of the details Janet relays, as I'm not allowed to take photos or touch anything. Mechanical things don't come easily to me when they are auditorily explained. I need to understand how things work in a much more physical way. Janet introduces me to three men in the machine shop while she takes a call. The work area is tidy, but a century's worth of steam and grease and human sweat cake the tooling machines. Nobody says a word until someone's cell phone rings and one of the guys picks it up. Another machinist who's in Florida on vacation is calling everyone to say hi. They put him on video and the guys all laugh. Janet brought someone here, wants to know what we do, one of the men says, snickering. The 6 guys working down here in the machine shop are putting out as much work as the 28 guys that used to work down here, the caller says in serious tones. That's quite a drop, I say. We keep up, another guy in the room says. There are a lot less machines running, so a lot less equipment and a lot less to work on, but also a lot less emergencies. I leave them alone with their phone call and I walk around the shop. Machinist emergencies, I think, are probably a lot less alarming than the ones running on repeat in my head. Machinists like Janet's father and pipe fitters like mine kept the whole operation afloat. When a machine broke down, machinists would make a new part. When a pipe needed fixing, my father got his wrench. That's how American industry used to be run. When machines failed, they were treated like a ship broken down at sea, fixed on the spot by trained and specifically skilled men. Indeed, all industry was more self-sufficient in earlier days, which meant it required more people to rely upon instead of a call center somewhere else. Since 1990, Maine has lost 13,000 out of 17,700 jobs in the paper-making industry, which is about 73%, with about 2,000 of those lost since just 2013. So not only a lot less machines, equipment, emergencies, but also a lot fewer jobs. When I leave the mill in its underlit rooms, I feel jet lagged out in the fractaled spring sun, like Rip Van Winkle, who fell asleep for 20 years, then emerged to a slanted world. The mill left an indent on me, like the one I imagine Rip's face acquired from resting against the bark of a tree during his protracted nap. I had finally seen the other side, my father's side. And even though a fraction of his life in that mill was revealed, like Van Winkle, I had crossed a threshold of some kind, and the world changed as soon as my perspective did.
Stop. And no, this is a perfect time for you to come in, because in your last two books, one of your concerns is that we're all behaving as if we're Van Winkle.
Oh, really?
Modernity is making its move and in a moving a pace, and we've had a connection to it in which we're increasingly disassociating ourselves from the land and our in a connection to the land, our sense of landscape, our sense of responsibility and stewardship of land, of nature, of the environment. But also we've sort of gone into this slumber, almost like intoxicated by our progress, but not recognizing the kind of costs that have been attendant, the costs that come with it. And so what it then means to be awake, to also not only to be awake, but also what it means suddenly, be awake in a different way, to recognize that all this time we were sleeping and these things were moving at pace, with dire consequences, and we're suddenly now, awake and alert to it, and then asking, what now? Where next? What do we do? How do we, reconnect in ways that we've been cut off, or where a chasm, has emerged because of modernity. So, your thoughts on that, and in particular, how in thinking about that, the ways your book is in conversation with with Kerri, where you're both concerned about modernity and its unwelcome effects.
Sure. Thanks, Garnette, and thanks, Kerri. This has been a terrific conversation already. I could just listen to the two of you go on. And after I
sometimes it's for hours. Trust me, you don't want to hear it.
We could be here for a while, but that would be okay with me. And I have a couple questions I'll add after this, but that's a very good question, Garnette. And certainly I'm interested in the ways in which we've ignored responsibility. We've failed to be grounded in a way. One of the interesting things about Milltown to me is how grounded it is, and how particular it is, and yet how generalizable it may be, how it may have to do with a sense of our sort of general catastrophe, general ambiguities, toxic ambiguities, as you called them.
Yeah.
How there are other mill towns. Indeed, the title of the book is not Mexico, Maine, it's Milltown, right? And so it is very much a book about Mexico, Maine, and yet it's very much a book that right on the cover with the title claims to be about some things we all face together, that there must be other mill towns. This is sort of a category for us. I'm also very interested in the way that in modernity, we actually fail to see, we don't have the vocabulary for what we might call the tragic. And we don't have the vocabulary for the fact that we are always giving up, undermining, foregoing, or destroying one or more goods in order to possess or secure one or more other goods. And what we do have, since we don't have the vocabulary for that, what we do have instead are strategies for not seeing it or not dealing with it. We have denial, we have paralysis, we have nihilism, and we have moral skepticism. And those are basically our recourses. When people try to call our attention to the costs that we've generated in order to possess or secure or integrate some goods, we often respond by denying that the costs are real. And you can see traces of that throughout Milltown. We often respond, if we recognize that the costs are real, we respond with paralysis. We're not going to do anything then. Well, how could I do something that would incur further costs? I'm just utterly paralyzed at the possibility of, say, undoing some environmental harm because it might cause some other cost.
Right.
Because I have to acknowledge that.
Wow, that's so interesting. Because can I say, are you going to
go ahead?
No, it's really interesting because I sort of went off on a path after Milltown, which I'm kind of going off on now, about writing about another form of this that you're talking about, of this cost of modernity, which is waste and discards, which is really exactly what you're saying. And I used Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Have you read that? Yeah. So like the residents of fictional Leonia are faced with the question, is their passion for the new and different because each day they consume new and personal household goods, or is it the joy of expelling, discarding, and cleansing themselves of recurrent impurities at the end of each day of the new items they've consumed and used? What is it, the joy of consuming or the joy of, it's that same conundrum you're talking about, I think. A little bit, right?
No, it's certainly related. Yeah. And
related.
I think even the other two strategies we have, the other recourse we have of nihilism, well, then it means nothing. You know, we tend to think we're so tempted in the direction of like the one best way, that there must be one best self-justifying way. And when there's not, we tend to say, well, then it's utterly meaningless. And then the final strategy, I think, is something like skepticism. Well, then we can't know. And I think all of those things are highlighted here in Milltown. I think when your reference to Calvino is very interesting here as well, because even the ambiguity there,
right? Whether
it is the enjoyment of the new things or the enjoyment of discarding the old things isn't knowable.
It's not knowable, exactly. And it's part of that invisibility, which I guess I was aiming at, which you were talking about, the paralysis or the silence or whatever you want to call it. And in Milltown and in some new things I've been thinking about, waste and discard. I mean, Milltown creates a toxic waste, which actually household waste, I should say to people, are only about 3% of wastes that we consider garbage or whatever. Everything else is basically toxic. And so this kind of modern waste is actually invisible too. There is its own paralysis. Like we hide it from pretty views. We put it in proprietary properties. This toxic from our mill, and this happens in the book. It's obscured in plastic bags or whatever, any kind of invisibility. Anyway, that's kind of what I was thinking about when you mentioned the invisibility or the modernity and how the paralysis of it. And that's what we do with the waste in Milltown. We just let's put it in this like nice little forest aperture and we'll deal with it later.
Right. And one of the things that I appreciated so much about Milltown, and this gets back to the acknowledgement theme that Garnette asked about earlier, was the sort of relentless acknowledgement of the costs. It was not even a book that was going to begin with acknowledgement and move on. It was a book that was going to acknowledge and acknowledge,
hammer and
continue acknowledging until the very end what the costs were, how they were accumulating,
right,
in bodies, in the town, in our broader community and society,
in our DNA.
And you even narrate, I told you this when we had a chance to talk a few weeks ago, how much I liked what happened on 305. You denied doing it on purpose, but I think I can't remember. I think it's something worth calling attention to anyway, because I wish I did things on purpose as well as you did them on accident in this.
Maybe it was. Oh no, I know. Go ahead. No.
See the bottom of 305 there?
Yeah.
This wonderful story about Governor King. You say King said in his speech to 40 state environmental officials and 40 paper industry officials who attended the conference, "You could make my life a lot easier if you could figure out a way to get rid of the dioxin."
Right.
I know what he meant. After the speech, allegedly, dioxin was not discussed at the conference. I mean, I think, you know, I actually want to go on and ask you about the ambiguity and uncertainty that we find on 308 as well. But I think that that's revealing of the ease with which we deny or make invisible all of these costs. And when we're tempted at the end of the book, even I'm tempted at the end of the book, as someone who wants these sort of acknowledgements to persist and knows that things must begin with acknowledgement. Even I'm tempted at the end of the book to say, yeah, but what now, right? Yeah, but what do we do? And I think one of the great strengths of the book is to not give up on relentless acknowledgement and in the face of the denial. And I think that what comes after even 305 there with the ease of denial, this real wrestling with the ambiguity that still comes out even after acknowledgement. I see on 308, if you can, I wonder if you would be willing to read the paragraphs, just the two of them, Mike would say, and then Mike and I chase. Those two paragraphs are really terrific.
Should I say who Mike is? No, I'll just read it. Mike would say this unpublished EPA assessment is a, quote, smoking gun, a phrase I've heard him use before. But what if there's no smoke arising from that gun, or smoke nobody can see, or the only smoke is the smoke screen that's suspended over our town? Trying to find the center of this dioxin narrative is like unwrapping a set of infinitely smaller nesting Russian dolls, or opening a Pandora's box where you can't tamp down the unforeseen, but continuously appearing problems that manifest from their release. Both metaphors work. It's an endless negotiation trying to find what doesn't want to be found, as Mike experienced in his Bigfoot quests. Bigfoot, the truth, the missing members of my family tree, the effects of dioxin on our bodies, all exist in a liminal space, which is not a space in which we want to live most days. Mike and I chase something that's near impossible to prove, and that ambiguity can traumatize us, as sociologists who study the effects of love canal found. Perception is the reality, another key phrase of Mike's, applies here as well. Whoever controls the story controls the discourse or the perception. And if you control the discourse, you establish the reality people accept. If the reality served as uncertainty, where do we go from there? Yeah, I forgot I wrote that.
Yeah,
I was in a fugue state, I think.
Well, if the reality served as uncertainty, where do we go from there? I mean, when I closed this book at the end, I thought, well, what lines come back to me even with the pages closed? That was one of them.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you can comment on that. I mean, I know you left the question hanging on purpose. I know it's a question for all of us. I know you don't mean to move on from acknowledgement immediately to here's what we do. But what are some of the ways we might respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that question was literally for myself. Where do I go from here? I was asking myself that, like, what do I do now? Here I am at the end of the line. I'm with the guy who believes in Bigfoot. He's like the accumulation of all the sort of toxic ambiguity, you read sociology books and he's the definition of what happens to people. Although he's also a really smart and wonderful man. So I was like, what do I do now? But part of what I really wanted to do was I mean, to really leave it open-ended, because I felt like, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I'll just say it anyway. It is, if I close it and I say, here's what we can do, that everybody's going to think it's okay, especially a certain class of liberal, progressive, East Coast folk who are going to be like, oh, it's nice and tidy. You know, it's okay. There's something happening. Somebody's doing something. But so if I left it really open and like sort of scary, that people would feel unsatisfied, and maybe somebody would want to pick it up from here and do something. Like, my job's done, reveal, not prescribe, you know, that's my job as this, you know, in conflict transformation, you know, something I studied in Sweden in communication for development. This is like really one of the earliest stages of transformation, is to reveal, not for me to do everything. And so many books do that. They want to reveal and prescribe and reveal and prescribe. It's just, it doesn't work that fast. You know, people, this book has to like settle into the consciousness of not only the people that live there, but other people who can actually make a difference, like state or federal legislators, or books like mine, not just my book, but like, so to try to shove it all through at once it's not temporally correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that, oh, go ahead, Garnette.
No, go ahead. No.
Okay, and that squares with this relentless acknowledgement that's going on in the book. And it does bring up a second question that I have. And then, by the way, everybody who's attending should feel free to put questions in the Q&A, because we're getting there soon.
Yes, I saw one by Kendra Green, the ever wonderful Kendra Green.
Kendra's here. Nice.
Oh, yes, whose book everybody should run out and buy. I'll mention that later, but continue now.
Okay. Yes, and I know that we have students who submitted interesting questions to me already, and I said, get ready for the Q&A. So students who have questions you submitted yesterday, submit them right here. We've talked a lot about some of the virtues or characteristics that you need as a writer, someone who will pay attention.
Oh, huh.
Someone who will listen, right? This is interesting, coming off of last week's conversation that we had with Taya Miles. We asked her, what are the virtues needed to tell a story like the one you've told, the more complex version of Detroit's story? And she focused on three things: patience, community, and love. And you've talked about listening. You've talked about practices of attention. I wonder, what are the virtues that a reader needs to read this well?
That's a great question, because some people can come at this angrily, I think,
right,
defensively even. I mean, right off the top of my head, for the same thing, listening to, you know, listening to the people in the story, but also listening to what's between the lines of the story. I think listening is an underused skill right now in our country. and giving, and just putting your politics aside, really. And I did, for writing this book. I had to, because it was, you know, it's not, if you have an opinion and you go into something with an opinion, then there's no way you're going to take anything out of it that's not already something you believe in. So that's an act of listening, I guess, or reading with like just a really open mind about, don't go into it thinking you know what the working class is, or what the American dream is, or what toxic poisons are, or like mill workers are. You know, Dino is a mill worker who skis every day. He's an interesting guy. He's a sweet, loving man who stutters and, you know, loves his family more than anything. You know, he's a complicated person. But he's an ordinary person too. So just, I think, going into this without having, you know, put your preconceptions and your politics aside.
Mm-hmm. Are we ready to take some questions from other people attending?
Yes, but can I say something? It may be a question disguised as an observation. You know, when you began Noah, you started by talking about the tragic. And one of the things you were, acknowledging was, how, our desire to, pursue, one set of, goods or goals, causes a displacement or undermines in the next set, and so we're sort of left with this discomfort, or maybe even guilt. And in saying that, I recognized, Paul Ricoeur in that remark, in the symbolism of evil, which I know you also engaged with in The Gardener's Dirty Hands. And it struck me that one of the things that, am I saying Ricoeur's name properly? Am I pronouncing it right? One of the things that he was concerned with was how we had lost a sense of the tragic, and even lost a symbolism of the tragic. That one of the things, it was his focus in that book, was the way in which we tell ourselves stories, or tell each other stories, to try to make some kind of give narrative form to these symbols we consider tragic. But one of the things that was fascinating about Kerri's book, which I'm still thinking about, is how she expanded the symbolism of the tragic. That you came to or even she reversed some of the symbolism of the tragic. So we've come out to see in machines and mechanics as the symbolism of the tragic. But in that scene that she read, you recognize how these machines are these, as it were, tools of modernity. We're also bound up with ideas of dignity and in a satisfactory labor and community and togetherness, but also something as simple as a sheet of paper that you can't read Milltown and then write a letter again, or in a print, in a CV, without thinking, exactly, or even the book itself you're reading without thinking of how tragic a thing paper is. And so suddenly in paper itself has become this whole terrain, this rich symbolic terrain.
Yeah,
the tragic is now inscribed onto the paper before you even put your hand to write on it or to read something from it. And so in other words, one of the things that this book does, I think maybe in ways that Ricoeur wasn't even thinking of or expecting, is how it deepened the sense of the tragic. And it's one of the things that we actually need, and it's desperate. And in both of your books are in competition with each other. What does it mean to lose the sense of the tragic and to actually have that restored, and to restore it in a way that's not maudlin, or sentimental, but find ways to properly juxtapose humor and melancholy, and direct it along the axis of dignity. And one of the things, I keep saying about acknowledgement or being seen, which is one of the things that Milltown does. But one of the things that it does is, apart from giving room to voices that are often ignored, or seeing people that are often overlooked, is it invites us to see anew things that we previously thought of innocent or anodyne.
Yeah.
Suddenly a sheet of paper now becomes this symbolically tragic thing.
Yeah, it's like the story, really. I guess that could have been my answer to your first question. But I did use not bleached paper for the book. I just want to point that out to everybody. It was not bleached with chlorine products. But yeah, I say that when I talk to some students too, are like big groups of people, and say, look around, just everybody right now, look around. I'm looking at everybody's background, and look around your room and think of all the things made of paper right now, and you will never think of it again the same way. If you read this book and look around your room, there's so many pieces of paper that are so innocuous, that are like killing my family, and not just my family, but like, you say other Milltowns, but it's also these toxics are in every single person's DNA to levels that are carcinogenic right now. Like everybody on this phone call, sorry.
Yes, there's 6 lovely questions. There's questions from Kendra Green, the author of that terrific book, which we'll say at the end so people won't forget. Maddie Castille, anonymous attendee. This person shows up a lot at webinars. Izzy Oliver and
anonymous attendee attends every webinar.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah, I have no clue how he or she has all the time in the world, like everywhere. But yeah,
there's a question by Kavita in the chat as well.
Yes, and I counted that. Yes.
Let's answer them all. We can do it. The
Yes.
three of us. You can help me if you think of something I didn't, please. We can all. So Kendra, you want me just to ask them out loud? Kendra, or you want to ask? Go ahead. Yeah, you ask.
I'm struck by the tension of visibility. We have these strategies for not seeing. Kerri brought up how things that don't want to be found don't get found, but also how happy most people are to be seen. Kerri, would you talk about what the photographs in this book do for the work entire?
Yeah.
Kerri, it's in a Kendra Green. I think it's her.
It is. Yes, it's our Kendra.
Splendid book. The Museum of Wales you will never see. So if there's anybody who's thinking very much about what it means to see and actually can talk about it in a way that's at once, full of whimsy and wisdom, it's her. So this is a plug for her book, which is actually one of the best things I read last year. So the Museum of Wales you will never see. But Kerri?
Yeah, so the photographs, which and a lot of people ask, but they operate on a bunch of different ways. They're not labeled because I want them to be their own sort of story, like running their own sort of narrative running throughout the book. And they're really like a heartbeat a little bit. Like it's that same kind of driving like thing that you were mentioning earlier, but it's like a heartbeat of the book. Here's a photo. It's the sort of ordinary life, the sort of that people are living, and also just a way to actually see people, because they, I wanted their face and their environment to be seen. You can describe it, but I think seeing it is also helpful. It's another kind of storytelling method. And I'm a photographer, and it's important to me. I see things. I said that in that passage, I'm a very physical, visual person. I can't learn things. So I added that as part of it. But photos are also a part of this whole idea. And it's a whole other discussion about memorials and monuments to things like our town. I did this whole other project for the Architectural League, just sort of looking at monuments and how we commemorate resource development and industry, but we don't memorialize the environmental consequences of the work. And what I tried to do in that report was just to rethink the monuments in our town, like Paul Bunyan or the bust of the guy who built the mill and things like that, rethink monuments. And so these photographs are like a new kind of monument to the people in this town who don't really have monuments to ordinary people, right? We just don't do that. We're like, here's Joe and here's a monument. So this is kind of a memorial to that too. So that's part of it. I could go on, but I won't. That's the general idea of it.
Also like that they weren't illustrations. So often photographs are used as illustration and then seem to be inferior to the text, but by making them in conversation with the text. And
that was a nod to Sebald.
Yes. Yes. And so it also was a way of actually, again, seeing and acknowledging these people,
right?
Rather than saying, "Oh, this is here to illustrate."
Here they are. It's just
way of saying, "Look at me again. My words, illustrating my words." This is saying, "Oh, look at the people that we're talking about. Look at them."
Right.
We have a question from Maddie Castille, one of our students.
I know Maddie. Don't I know Maddie?
You do know Maddie.
Yes.
She was part of the writing workshop in the fall.
She's a good writer too.
That's right. How do you navigate knowing that you've been exposed and are likely continuing to be exposed to uncountable toxics? Considering how many notebooks I've used, diapers I've changed, period products I'm tempted to throw out, I'm trying to navigate how to make sense of my unavoidable continued exposure to dioxin and things like it.
Yeah. I mean, when I started writing this book, it was one of the first things I started doing was just eliminating what I could, honestly. It's impossible. Really, it's sort of impossible to, you can do the sort of direct stuff, buy safer. Is it ERG, environmental working group. You can plug in like Noxzema and it'll tell you how chemical it is on a scale of 1 to 5 or something. That's like a very practical way of doing it. And I did all that. I tried to eliminate as many things as I can, but the stuff that's in our environment with, cars and our water and, like I was just saw in the mill, the Sappi mill, which is just another mill in Maine, just got brought into a gigantic lawsuit. They're suing them. It just happened like yesterday, the day before, because there's so much PFAS in the water there. If forever, they call it forever chemicals. So I emailed the lawyer. I'm like, there's more than that there. Like, keep looking. So I don't know. There's really a lot you can't do. And what you can do is you can vote for legislators that will, you could move to Europe where they have different kind of laws. No, seriously. I mean, the laws that we have are reactionary instead of preventative. I'm just broadly speaking, you have to prove that the chemical causes you harm, whereas in Europe, it's the opposite, the precautionary principle, right? So, or vote for people that will choose you to live instead of dying. I mean, this is the problem. It's like, again, what are the solutions? I mean, it has to be legislated. This is really, it's policy and legislation. So you can run for office, you can vote for office, you can move to Europe. I don't know. It's really, you can keep it individually away from you as much as you want, but I hate to be a bad news bear.
Maddie has another question. We'll come back to that later if we have time at the end. Anonymous attendee says, what do you find to be one of the most frustrating and possibly detrimental misconceptions of the working class in the US?
Well, that they're dumb or they're racist or they're rednecks, gun loving, etc. That kind of trope. Certainly there are people like that. Certainly they're not just the working class. Part of those are the most, what was the second part of that question? Wait, let me look. Yeah, I mean, that's really frustrating to me because I took politics out of this in researching and meeting people where they're at, and nobody talked about politics with me. We talked about like, hey, I have a new grandchild, or let's go skiing, or if you kind of remove this kind of preconception again away, you can really talk to people and talk about, things that you have in common. And I know that sounds really idealistic, but I did it for 10 years. And our town, and this is not to say it's political book. My book is very political. And our town went from being like a blue collar liberal voting for Obama to being the biggest flip in the state and voting for Trump. So there were a lot of politics there, but I'm just saying it's that kind of, I just think any kind of generalizations about a population is a bad idea. I know that sounds pretty naive, and but it worked for me. And if you really, I get a lot of people trying to work their way around it. But but what about this? They'll say, okay, I understand that, but they voted for this, they did this. There's a lot of complicated reasons why people vote for people like Trump, or people vote for against their interests, or if you read the book, not to really, you'll see why. There's a lot of, anyway.
Yeah, I think that reminds me of the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago when I mentioned having forgotten that, or having not known actually, that Arlie Hochschild actually blurbed your book for, I think, the Web or something like that. I mentioned there was some resonance there, especially in the voting against their interests piece.
Yeah.
You mentioned. And I found incredible resonance with her work. And I would recommend that those who are in the audience and want to have read Milltown and want to follow up with another work like it, read Arlie Hochschild's. Oh
God, what was the name of it?
I'm going to forget the name of the book.
Strangers
in their own land. Yes.
Yeah. Nice job, Garnette.
Nice save. He's Googling away while we're talking.
And their hair.
No.
Good old-fashioned memory.
I was Googling.
So I want to give a little context to Izzy's question here. And last week, again, talking with Taya Miles, she had said that the positive story is always easy to find. And she implied, without saying exactly as much, the negative story, the purely negative story, is usually easy to find, fairly
Right.
easy to find. But the more complex story, the real story, I think is what she called it, requires patience, is a lot harder to find. And this question here from Izzy Oliver is a question about difficult truths, the hard to find real story. What was one of the most difficult truths you had to confront or find in your work for this book?
That I couldn't find the truth. Like it literally was. I mean, I am like a terrier. Like I really wanted to find something, like some smoking gun or something. I mean, there probably is. But I wanted to I really, as much as the reader did, I wanted to come away with something I could hold in my hand. And it was just frustrating to like, also literally the more I researched, the more it was like a joke. It was like the Russian nesting dolls. It was like that, except the Russian nesting dolls were getting bigger. Like as I researched, it expanded like the universe or a black hole. I don't even know what that scientific term is, but like things kept getting bigger and bigger. And I just was like, I have to stop or I'm going to go insane, because it was so frustrating. There was no end to any of it. And so much so that like my next book is going to be sort of tangent, just taking one tiny piece of it, like I said, about waste and discards, and writing another whole book. Mm-hmm. Because there's so much more to think about. Mm-hmm. So it's frustrating not to have an end, but I guess it gives me more material to write about.
Right. So in some ways, the hardest truth to find or confront was the one from 308. It was exactly that. The reality served as uncertainty. Where do we go from here?
It is exactly that. Yes.
So do we have time for 3 more questions? Because that's what we have here between.
I do.
Yes. Okay. And I want to tackle Aidan Allen's question, which is an important question. Though Aidan seems to think we might think it up as less worthy of our time than it really is, but it's an urgent question, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Aidan asks, you've all been discussing this idea of relentless acknowledgement. In this relentless pursuit of acknowledging the costs and all of that, rather than falling into denial, paralysis, nihilism, or skepticism, how do we maintain hope when it seems that anything and everything comes at some sort of cost? A very defeating feeling, I would say. I know Kerri mentioned that her goal is to reveal rather than to prescribe, which is perhaps not in line with this question, but I figured I would go ahead and ask anyway.
Yeah, actually, I mean, you can see I'm a actually pretty generally happy person. And what I do is I'm not, and my husband pointed this out to me pretty recently. He's like, I just look forward all the time. It's not necessarily hope, but it's just forward, because what's the point of not looking forward? I'm just like, what's next? What's next? You know? And I think that keeps me motivated. And I guess that's a form of hope. I'm not directly addressing any kind of hope, but yeah, you just have to keep moving forward. Just tomorrow's a different day, as Scarlett O'Hara would say. But it's true, right? Mm-hmm. I don't look back. I look back in order to research it maybe, but I don't look back at the past and regret or consider or worry. I'm a little bit of, I am really hard-headed about that too. I'm not the kind of person that dwells or regrets or holds grudges. I'm really not. So I've trained myself to be that way. So it was.
Yeah. Can I jump in also because it almost has the ring of Camus to it, Aidan stuff, nihilism. And I mean, Camus, well, not of all people, but Camus, had once made a remark that, what was it again? It's like, there is no hope of life without the despair of life. No, there's no love of life without despair of life. And what is important to recognize is that hope itself is grounded in story, in a story of who we are, what we've done, what we can and should become, where we ought to go. And in telling a story, in other words, in telling true stories, what was the remark that Didion said? We tell stories in order to live, but in telling true stories of a place, it then allows us to start, see more squarely what that place is. What are the possibilities, the perils, the opportunities, the limitations? And therefore, hope is then therefore possible because, we now have a more clear understanding of the ground on which we stand. Yeah. And then have a sense of what it then means to build a ladder from this ground, up. So hope doesn't, necessitates that thinking that, things are going to actually work out, or just Pollyannish view of the word. But what hope says, hope is, if nothing else, if not a promise. And that promise, banks very much on the kind of stories we've chosen to embrace, the kind of stories that we've chosen to believe, the stories that we think ought to be, and ultimately will be triumphant. And so, if you think of the things that you're set in context with, nihilism, paralysis, denial, moral skepticism, these are all stories. These are all a way of explaining the world, or rather, all a way of denying the world, denying the realities of the world in its horror, but the world in its promise. And so, therefore, in the midst of in that climate, acknowledgement, in acknowledgement of what is true, what is right, but also what is unjust, what the obstacles are the grounds that hope needs. That hope needs fertile soil, in a soil which itself is roots go down to in a true understanding of things, of calling things by their true names. And
because here we are talking about it, right? And that's a form of hope too, right?
Yeah. And then also given a sense of the tragic, you need a sense of in a tragic, and then also the divine comedy, as it were, where to begin, where to dip, where to rise. And so hope also needs a proper understanding of the tragic, and where the tragic is, and where the tragic ought to be, and therefore where is our presence needed, what it means then to actually have faithful presence, when you can properly begin to see the tragic and begin to understand the possibilities and opportunities with which to work, in a clutch and in a lane tight hold of a promise.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote that in the book. We tell ourselves stories to live. So I should have known that answer. I think it's in the book. That I know we have to probably go, but this anonymous attendee is still having some trouble fully accepting my suggestion of leaving politics behind, or not coming with assumptions, as they can hinder what we see when writing. I am under the assumption that coming to places, knowing what we bring, is good. Yeah, you're right. It is good. I'm just saying, when you're listening to other people, you really have to don't impose your politics on them. You can impose it in your writing later if you want, but or not really. I mean, good writing is writing all the things Garnette just said, and then letting the reader be the judge. It's not you being the judge and the arbiter of these things. So, yes, there's a lot of didactic writing, but if that's what you want to write, go ahead. But that's not what, literary writing is not about. That it's leaving gaps and places between the footfalls, for interpretation. So, coming with a sense of what you're going to do also leaves curiosity out of the factor. How are you going to, if you come with a straight idea of what you're going to write and you don't veer from that, your curiosity is not going to, I certainly would have never written a book if I wasn't curious and let myself be open to the possibilities of what this could be. So I don't know.
Yeah. I want to add something to it, because I know that one of the ongoing questions, one of the urgent concerns of our time is the relationship between proximity and writing. Can you write about someone that's distant from you, in terms of the experience, the station in life, in a ethnic, makeup, religious belief. And so it's important to lay the cards on the table to show all the baggage that you've brought. But if you've written long enough, or if you even just a sort of reflect long enough, you recognize how much we're mistress to our very selves. And so the sense that I can bring like laid out, what is it that I bring, sometimes maybe assumes too clear an eye on our very selves, because often I don't even know what I bring until I start seeing other people's reaction to me. Every writer knows it, because every writer needs an editor, somebody who's separate and apart from us, and who can see things with a clear eye that we're too close to see. So we're often too close to ourselves. That yes, it's important to say have these beliefs, but also to actually leave yourself open to those beliefs being changed, those beliefs being challenged, or even those beliefs being reinforced in ways that you didn't come to expect. But also the act of writing and the encounters in doing reporting and research is not just merely to gather beliefs. So for instance, there was so much that was inaccessible to Kerri in this excerpt that I asked her to read. But and these people saying, oh, you're not allowed to take pictures, there's only so much we will tell you. And the kind of habits in a mind, and the gestures that they had, and their structures of care and affection, that there's a lot that's been being told by that. And so it's important that to recognize that people are more than the sum total of their beliefs. Again, the same way in which on the perils of writings about the working class, and you see it all the time when people sometimes writing about race, is the victimization narrative, that people are the sum total of what has happened to them, what has been arrayed against them. But there's so much more than that. People with their capacities for joy and for awe and for contemplation and for there's so much more. And therefore, in coming to have these encounters, to say, this is partially an encounter to understand this person, to understand their beliefs, and to think about the world. But some of it is also for the sake of encounter, to act, what is it like to be in this person's presence? What is it like to be disagreed with by this person, or to be embraced by this person? Or what are the confusions and mysteries that is important as writers, and especially in a sense of Wheaton, this language is something that I don't want to lose hold of. And I think people here are more familiar with this language, is that it's very important that we don't think of writing as an act of mastery. That mystery, that the word is suffused with mystery. What was it that Herbert said? God's grandeur, the sense of mystery that actually exists in different encounters with human beings. So as you're going to interview, or going to the report, or going to the research, it's important also to make sure that you leave open the possibilities of mystery, in a room for not knowing. And then in not knowing, begin to ask, what does not knowing invite? What can I discover in the places of not knowing? And what does it mean to even actually acknowledge those gaps, those disconnects, those chasms? But also, what kind of beauty can I take in mystery? And so we're at school where people say, oh, you can't know God completely, but you can know God truly. And so, what does it mean then to, go into interviews like that, to think that, oh, I'm having an encounter with, people who are image bearers, and to understand, how much can be known, and again, how much, cannot be known, but to leave that possibility, and to recognize, even in the mysteries, even in the not knowing, that you still have way more than you can actually even handle, or can or even begin to know what to do with by way of writing. So it's to say, not to actually have the political beliefs as an obstacle, because even many people who say, oh, this is my real political beliefs, if you start scratching hard enough behind those political beliefs, they're like, oh, well, my mom believed that, my grandma believed that, my great grandma believed that. So I believe that, of course, I should spank your kids. That's how I go up. My mom spanked me. That's good enough for me. It's good enough for my kid. Or someone's like, oh no, don't spank kids. My mom never touched me. And so, a lot of those are not coming from this deep reflection on psychology as much as, how much it's shaped. So sometimes, people even change their opinion and like what they like or not like what the same thing 15 times in a day. So it's then to say the things that people feel so hardened about are unyielding or are not budging, rather than spend so much time with that, and not that is unimportant, is to like, what might it mean to actually open up areas of knowing, open up the possibilities or the capacity for knowing.
Mhm.
And sometimes you can then get to the point. So I'm going to leave this because I know other people have to talk, but generally when you go to interview somebody,
Yeah.
they want to put you is on their porch. You come, they give you some lemonade or give you iced tea. Where you really want, where everybody wants as a writer, as a reporter, is that you want to be in the kitchen, because this is the kitchen where people become open,
Exactly.
the real intimate and personal and warm, and embracing conversations happen. So you want to be very careful not to say something on that front porch that will get you ejected, and they'll send you out, on the sidewalk.
Right.
You want to actually, have the kind of conversation where somebody will go, you know what, forget this, porch, come on in, let's sit in the living room. You know what, I'm liking this conversation, come to the kitchen, and help me make some soup. So, to go then begin immediately by saying, okay, here are my politics, here are your politics, is to suddenly say, I have decided to relegate myself to the front porch or to the sidewalk.
Yeah. I was going to say it's all really in interviewing techniques too. It really is. I mean, I teach interviewing classes, and there's a lot in what you just said that is completely relevant. Yeah. Learn how to interview.
We missed. Oh, there's Kavita. Yes.
Yes. The question Maddie asked was one we just answered by way of that conversation about mystery and not mastery.
Oh, good.
And so let's answer Kavita's question since it's been up there since we first started taking them, and then we can close the evening. I'll read it out, and whatever thoughts the two of you may have, we can end with. Whenever I've been involved in urban policy planning, working class perspectives and input have been ignored or overlooked by local policy entities and federal entities like HUD. Do you think one longer term solution is a policy requirement that the perspective of those most impacted are centered or should be centered in any policy planning?
Yes. No, it's a great idea. Please do that. Yeah, yes, I don't understand. I don't know anything about that land that you have been involved in with urban policy. I'll let you guys maybe talk about that a little, but I just don't see their perspective taking in at any level, really. I mean, there's a lot of talking about it, like, oh, the working class jobs, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, all of them, they just talk about it. But actually, I don't know what it means when they talk about it, because there has been no change, and it's not just been stagnant, it's been like on the decline in these working class towns. And so I don't, they just need to be even just slightly more inventive about what to do. Anybody help me?
What I will say, by way of, in a non-bias, in a celebration, of your book, is how your book makes the case for a different way of engagement. It makes the case for the importance of community engagement, of including perspectives, and not in a way that's condescending, or paternalistic, to say, oh, we went here, we had a town hall meeting, we listened to them, now we're gone. It's but to make the case to recognize that people often have a very good idea of what's good for them as a community.
Right. Yeah.
They have, more than anyone else, richly understand what the fate of their communities and their neighborhoods ought to be, that they actually are many times wonderfully not only resourceful but inventive about what needs to happen and what can and should work in their communities. And even in spite of the many things that that sort of erode communities from within, different conflicts with different interest groups, or NIMBYs as they call it, like not in my in a backyard. That again, even that, it still gives a sense of how does this community, this neighborhood sees themselves, see their fates bound up with each other, but also how can we actually have them in a partners in their own in a development and honor and respect, and give rich room for their agency and allow it to flourish.
Yeah.
And also many times it's not just one neighborhood, the way it holds promise for other neighborhoods in looking and seeing the examples that happen. So I think one of the things that your book does is to say, here's what actually happens when you listen to people's perspectives. Here's actually also what happens when you chosen to ignore them. And yes, there are no this town, but you begin speaking to a variety of people, and so what you think is not there is right there, present in the mouths and the hearts of so many people who you've interacted with.
And that's sort of what you're suggesting, that sort of people just knowing what's good for their towns. That's kind of the third or fourth step in conflict transformation. It's like doing that next step. It's like, yeah.
Well, there are so many ways we could follow up on that point.
Yeah.
I will make a couple comments on centering those perspectives, and then try to bring us to conclusion here. One of the things that I would follow up on is Garnette's point about partnership. That so much what goes by the name of centering the perspectives of those most affected is not partnership, but is just bringing people in and making them submit to a way of knowing that is not their own. Bringing people in and involving their way of knowing their community is important if we're going to truly center their perspective. I think another question is who does that centering? I remember asking one of my PhD committee members a long time ago, well, shouldn't we just make sure, don't we just need to make sure that certain people are at the table? And he said, well, yeah, but who makes sure that people are at the table?
Yeah. Huh.
And then who makes sure that those people make sure that people are at the table? It's the turtles all the way down problem. And at some point, we need to deal with the fact that most of the time when we're making these decisions about whose perspective to center, it's me making those decisions. At what point, and I'm using myself in a sort of metonymous way here, right? It's people who look like me, who are sort of technocratically making these decisions, sort of best practices in planning idea. At what point do we get people involved, and what are the real choices that are being made at the table at that point, at the earliest possible engagement? How are we centering those ways of knowing? And then I guess the final thing I would point out here is another thing that Garnette pointed out. Kerri's book actually does this work of centering this perspective. And it may be that policy and planning can't do what detective work and revealing and acknowledging and storytelling can do. Right? It may be there's a little bit of overlap in the Venn diagram, but there are limitations to policy and planning in terms of that acknowledging, storytelling, and centering, in the same way that there are limitations to prescription for the person who's doing the revealing and the acknowledging. And I emphasize that not to suggest that the limits mean we can't get there, but that the limits mean we need each other. We need people working in both of these areas. We need both these modes of being in the world, both these modes of being for others. And we need them in partnership, not just beside each other, but in true partnership.
True partner. I should say there's a really good book coming out called Pollution is Colonialism by Max Lieberon. And her book is, it's a methodological text about how to center research and thinking like this. It's really incredible. She, so much so that the footnotes, she even, it's really hard to explain, but anyway, Google it. In the footnotes, she takes like, she even discusses the footnotes and what the footnotes mean and how she doesn't want to put the footnotes in the back of the book because that's putting something sort of in the periphery. Like she talks about that in the footnotes. It's kind of fascinating. She's really an incredible, she has this whole website called Discard Studies, but she's got this, anyway, that book might be helpful for thinking about stuff like that and how to do it when you're saying, you know, it's who gets to, when do you get to bring them in? She's looking at that in a methodological way. It's really interesting.
And what do you speak? No, I remember because the person who had asked the last question, the anonymous attendee, I didn't want the person to think that, oh, we were beating up by saying, oh, this is the approach, because I recognize the person was asking, you know, what does it mean to take differences seriously? And also, you know, what it means to also be honest and transparent about who you are and what you bring. So I recognize that the question, you know, had those concerns. And as both of you speak, it hit me that one thing that we should be thinking about then is to, you know, almost sometimes think not even personal, but disciplinarily, to ask, what is it that planning doesn't have, that urban planning doesn't have, or that urban studies doesn't have, or that policy doesn't have? And therefore, you know, what it means then, not only to think we're trying to get as many perspectives in our discipline, but to actually recognize we have to actually look outside of our disciplines for other perspectives. So, for instance, what might in a Kerri Arsenault in a bring to us, you know, who,
well, that's what I,
rich perspective of not merely a storyteller, but an environmentalist and a daughter, and you know, and so many other things that, you know, that we can't all bring together in any one person or in one group, but also in any one discipline. And so, one of the things to think about then is to say, in laying the cards on the table, you know, and recognizing the real difference, sometimes before we even actually meet anyone, we should sometimes lay the cards on the table before ourselves and say, what doesn't this discipline have? And so what perspectives would I need to, you know, to look elsewhere outside of my discipline to have that conversation? And so, you know, that person, you know, is asking, like, asks, how can we be honest with ourselves and be open and take differences seriously? And one way of doing that is sometimes, you know, doing a real, in a house check, as to say, what's wrong with our discipline, you know, or, you know, what's wrong with the conversations we're already having, and how do we get outside of, you know, that bubble or that silo or that the narrow self-contained sphere.
well, that's one thing okay, and then we'll end it. I'm sorry. But communication for development, which is what I studied in Sweden, was part of development work. And what it was is people like me who were we acted at these NGOs as communicators to interpret or to help interpret or to communicate with or to communicate for, or depending on what the organization needed. And it's something that I see missing from so many nonprofit or NGO organizations. There's a communication person. I'm not saying a PR person, but like an actual, like a think writer, like this kind of thing. And maybe that's what like HUD needs, or that's what every government organization, they need somebody who can like tell stories. They need storytellers.
Right, we do. And we've had two of them tonight.
Good answer.
I want to call attention to the fact that Kerri Vandervelde, one of our co-hosts in the background here, did put the book that Kerri Arsenault just mentioned in our chat. So if anybody attending wants a link to the book, it's there.
By the way, a big shout out to Kerri, who is just a dream. All things are possible here in Zoomland because of her. You know, left out our own organizational devices, you'll be, you know, seen as logging at 9:15 and then the next person at 9:30. Yeah, so many thanks to Kerri. And not just for organizational stuff. She's just a whirlwind of grace and generosity.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I tell all of my students that the first thing they need to know is who Kerri Vandervelde is, and to be in touch with her. And that is the way to keep on top of things. That's the way that I keep on top of things. So thank you for giving that shout out to her, Garnette. Really, thanks to both of you. Those of you who are in the audience tonight and will be around on April 6th might want to join us in that evening for Reuben Miller, conversation with him about his book, Halfway Home, which is getting a lot of press right now, and deservedly so.
Yes.
We'll be hearing from him and have a chance to read along with him and ask him some questions at the very end. So plan to come back and join us on April 6th. And if we were all together in person, Garnette and Kerri, you would hear a great round of applause. You have my own personal thanks for joining us, taking this time this evening. I couldn't be more grateful. So thank you very much.
I feel the same.
Everybody who joined us, we know that it's not easy after a full day of Zoom to join and be with us. So many, many thanks to all the students and to the visitors and to the thoughtful questions. All thank you very, very much.
Yeah, and thanks for this. I mean, what a joy. I want to keep going, but I should
I do too. We weren't wrong when we said we could do 5 hours.
I know. It's just really wonderful to talk to you guys. Thank you so much for engaging with the book as you did.
Agreed.
Yeah.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. And we hope to see many of you on April 6th.
Yes, thank you.
Good night.